It all started when an ugly servant and the young daughter of a noble family secretly fell in love. Even though they were just kids, they enjoyed every single moment they could spend together. But their happiness didn't last long. The girl's family soon found out about their forbidden love, and threw the servant out of the palace where he worked. They left the poor boy abandoned in a freezing forest during deadly cold weather. With no money to buy even a bite of food to survive and no weapon to defend himself, the boy was completely helpless. That day was the last time the girl was able to see him. In those final moments, just before they were forced apart, the boy made a promise to her. He vowed that one day he would return, but strong and wealthy enough to be worthy of her, and when that time comes, he will ask for her hand in marriage. It was the only thing that could calm the girl's tears, giving her hope to see him again. But things didn't go as they had hoped. 15 years passed. The boy survived that horrible day, but instead of becoming someone honorable and worthy, he became the most feared and hated villain in the entire continent. The rumors about him were so terrifying that people began calling him the Demon Sword of Chaos. Just hearing his name was enough to make people shake in fear, or worse. Seeing him in person, that was something no one wanted to experience. On the other hand, the girl became someone completely different. She grew up to be a symbol of justice and hope, known as the Star of Righteousness and the Lunar Sword. She wasn't just one of the most skilled warriors in the kingdom. Her breathtaking beauty was on a different level than others. Her looks were so captivating that anyone who saw her face and body fell in love at first sight. Strangely enough, even after 15 years, she stayed loyal to that boy from her childhood, without even knowing he's alive or not. She hadn't forgotten his promise, and that's why she refused to let any man get close to her. This was just the start of the story, but things really got interesting when the scene shifted to the present day in a bustling inn. The place was packed, with people happily chatting about their achievements and adventures. In one corner, a young man sat quietly, observing the lively crowd and wondering if this little inn was truly the famous hub for merchants and travelers he'd heard about. The young man, Ju Yun, was a warrior with a spear he kept carefully wrapped. He was feeling pretty good, relieved to have made it to this place safely, and even happier because the locals treated him so kindly. Out of either genuine kindness, or perhaps because they thought he was some skilled fighter, a group of adventurers invited Ju Yun to join their guild and work with them. But Ju Yun politely declined. He explained that he wasn't here for working, but a personal mission. More like a dream to chase, and a promise he absolutely had to keep. That was his priority, and nothing would stop him. Actually, no one wanted to stop him. However, a bald man in the group gave him a serious warning. He told Ju Yun to be really careful while moving around the area. Naturally, Ju Yun was curious and asked what he meant by that. With a creepy look on his face, the man explained there was a dangerous monster lurking near the village, a cruel, bloodthirsty person who hunted martial artists and carried their severed heads around to terrify others. Ju Yun looked like he was impressed by the horror story, but the truth was, he wasn't unfamiliar with it at all. Sipping his tea calmly, he acted as if this was exactly why he was there. In the middle of their conversation, someone, walked into the inn, instantly grabbing everyone's attention. And sure enough, it was the very man they had just been talking about, the monstrous, wild-looking figure with his infamous bloody bag. He dropped the bag onto the floor with a heavy thud and began walking forward. His presence alone was enough to send chills through the room, freezing everyone in their seats. Everyone except Ju Yun, that either didn't know him or didn't care who's he. The others were terrified, only dared to whisper amongst themselves, wondering if this was really that monster the rumor said. With an irritated look, the man barked at the attendant to call the innkeeper immediately. But the attendant nervously explained that the innkeeper was out running an errand and offered to help with whatever the man needed in the meantime. Trying to be polite, the attendant reached for what he assumed was the man's luggage, intending to carry it to a quiet room until the innkeeper returned. As soon as the attendant looked at the bag, he froze, realizing it wasn't at all what he had expected. Still, he decided to carry it. But before he could do anything, the man grabbed his hand, stopping him in his tracks. The room fell silent. Everyone watched in terror, thinking this might be the end for the poor attendant. With another chilling side glare, the monstrous man declared loudly that the bag contained his prey, and no one but him had the right to touch it. The attendant freaked out, trembling uncontrollably, and the only thing he could do was stammer out an apology for disrespecting him. This unsettling scene sparked murmurs among the crowd, with people whispering that this man was every bit as cruel as the rumors claimed. But before he could do anything, the bag suddenly started to move, and the noise immediately caught the man's attention. He turned toward it, his expression dark and menacing. With a voice that sent shivers down everyone's spine, he muttered an apology to his prey, saying he was sorry for letting it suffer and that he would now finish what he had started. Just as his hand reached for the bag, someone sprang into action, stopping him in his tracks. That someone was none other than Ju Yun. He didn't just dare to stop the monstrous man. He He stood tall and fearlessly challenged him to an honorable duel. The room went silent in utter disbelief. No one, not even the bald man from earlier, had expected this. Everyone was questioning whether Ju-Yun had lost his mind or had suddenly gone crazy. The monstrous man with the new wound on his face turned to Ju-Yun, his lips curling into a mocking grin. His tone dripped with disdain as he sneered, "You? Against me?" Ju-Yun, still brimming with confidence, boldly declared that he was here to confront the greatest enemy of the martial world, the one responsible for the suffering of every single person in the area. And of course, he was talking about this guy and not anyone else. He added that this was the dream and the oath that had driven him to come all this way. Hearing what sounded like a childish speech, the ugly, wild-looking man smirked before bursting into laughter, loud enough to echo for miles. Then, with a grin, he said something that caught Ju-Yun's attention. The man asked why Ju-Yun believed he was the so-called greatest enemy of the martial world. But before Ju-Yun could even respond, the man waved it off, as if he already knew the answer. Letting out a heavy sigh, the man began to explain that not only Ju-Yun, but everyone else, had misunderstood everything about him. However, before he could even finish his sentence, Ju-Yun cut him off, mocking him outright. It was clear Ju-Yun believed the man was just trying to make excuses to avoid a fight. With a loud clang, Ju-Yun slammed his spear into the ground, once again declaring that he had come all this way for one reason alone, to find and fight him. He made it clear that no excuses would be accepted. Seeing how determined Ju-Yun was, the monstrous man gave him a side glance, his expression unreadable, and said, "If that's the case, I accept your challenge, but I need to prepare first." Ju-Yun froze for a moment, shocked to hear this. Then, narrowing his eyes, he shouted, "Don't tell me you're planning to run away." Before Ju-Yun could get an answer from his opponent, the crowd around him started yelling at him, asking if he'd gone completely mad. They all made it clear that the infamous monster standing before him was not the kind of guy who'd ever back out of a fight. There was no way someone like him would run away just to avoid facing Ju-Yun. In everyone's eyes, this evil and ruthless man, who didn't care if his opponent was rogue or righteous and would do anything to win, had no reason to avoid fighting a kid like Ju-Yun. The crowd tried to stop the stupid-looking boy, voicing their concerns and practically begging him to reconsider, as they were convinced Ju-Yun was walking straight into a death trap, knowing fighting with this guy was as good as suicide. But Ju-Yun wouldn't back down. He'd sworn an oath, and no amount of warnings or fear could shake his resolve. He wanted to become the greatest in the world, and to do that, he had to take down the most hated and feared person around to achieve that. Soon later, Ju-Yun agreed to give the man a short time to prepare for the battle, and the monster disappeared into a room to get ready. At first, it seemed like he'd gone to prepare or make some plans before the fight, but that wasn't the case at all. As you well know, this monstrous, cruel-looking man was our protagonist, the servant boy who survived until now. Strangely enough, he wasn't preparing for the fight at all, but actually, he wanted to buy some time, desperately trying to figure out a way to run away without dueling. Our boy's name was Yahello, and he was only here to sell his prey, not to cause trouble or anything. And that prey he brought here happened to be a small boar he had barely managed to hunt earlier, not some martial artist's head or anything impressive like the rumors made him out to be. He was wondering why he never gets a single chance to clarify this misunderstanding about being labeled as not just an ordinary villain, but the martial world's biggest enemy. Yahello knew he couldn't even use his inner power, worst thing for a fighter that could happen in that era. Knowing better than anyone that he's as weak as a third-rate warrior, basically the equivalent of someone with an E-rank potential, the poor guy couldn't help but to think, why would people keep judging him only by his appearance? Panicked by the misunderstanding he was caught in, Yahello desperately tried to figure out a way to avoid dying in a duel with that persistent guy. The way Ju-Yun charged at him like a madman, all because Yahello out of kindness had stopped the inn attendant from touching his dirty bag, made him realize just how dire his situation was. Yahello really didn't want to die so easily, especially not in a duel with some good-looking guy. The boy also had dreams and promises to keep, something that didn't let him die before they were fulfilled. Speaking of her, fate had a strange sense of timing, because at that very moment, the girl Yahello was thinking about accidentally entered the same village he was in. The commotion and fuss Ju-Yun was causing by shouting for the demon sword of chaos to come out soon caught her attention. Since she'd also heard all the rumors about the so-called demon sword of chaos, she decided to approach Tassin and see what's going on. As soon as she arrived, she gently tapped on the neck of Ju-Yun. As the boy turned to see who had touched him, his eyes widened in shock and disbelief. That was the moment she took off her hat, revealing her face, and asked if he was the one planning to fight the demon sword of chaos. Her striking red eyes, which perfectly matched her pink and silver hair, and of course the huge size of her chest, made Ju-Yun's heart skip a beat, making him blushes, just like everyone else around them. Before he could say anything, another man's voice from behind him broke the moment. That man seemed to recognize her and exclaimed that she was the Lunar Sword, the direct disciple of the former greatest martial artist, Seol-hwa. Ju-Yun couldn't help but think that she, just like him, had come to take down the biggest enemy of the martial world, the Demon Sword of Chaos. Determined not to miss this chance to make a name for himself alongside her, he boldly declared that he wanted to team up with her, stating it would be an honor if she agreed to help him kill Yahello, the famous Demon Sword of Chaos. Seol-hwa finally realized what was really happening, and couldn't be any happier. Of course, she didn't care about the duel or Ju-Yun, but the fact that she'd finally found her lover location after 15 long years. She couldn't wait another second to see him, but her reaction completely confused Ju-Yun. He thought she was impressed by his bravery and intentions of challenging the demon sword, which made him feel like he's been chosen for making a baby with her. As Seol-hwa started to slowly walk forward, Ju-Yun began daydreaming and thinking big. He suggested again that they team up to fight Yahello, and after that, they could form a strong partnership and travel the world together. Meanwhile, inside the inn, everything seemed to be a little chaotic for Yahello. He was still desperately trying to figure out a way to avoid the duel, completely unaware of the chaos brewing outside. He couldn't stop thinking that the best solution was to report the situation to the authorities, as dueling was strictly forbidden by law. Just as he resolved to report as his responsibility thing as a normal citizen, the inn's wooden wall suddenly burst apart, slashed several times by a sword before someone made a dramatic entrance. The poor boy jumped into a corner, trembling as he tried to take cover, and of course it was Ju-Yun. Seeing him made Yahello scream in absolute fear, convinced his life was over before he'd even had the chance to marry Seol-hwa. Crawling backward, Yahello frantically started making excuses, saying he wasn't ready yet, and that Ju-Yun should wait a little longer, and even it's a private room that he shouldn't enter without permission. His panicked rambling was suddenly interrupted by Seol-hwa, who entered the room and said, "Finally, I've found you." Yahello was left completely speechless, either from seeing the love of his life or from realizing that girl was the one who made that dramatic entrance without even recognizing her. In a second, everything became clear that it wasn't Ju-Yun but the girl, who was using the poor boy's unconscious body to shatter the wall and the inn's door, only to prove what happens when someone disrespects Lunar Sword's precious and long-lost lover. As she tossed Ju-Yun's battered and unconscious body to the ground, Seol-hwa turned her attention to Yahello and began walking toward him. She proudly declared that she had become one of the strongest martial artists on the continent and now had more than enough money to start the best life for both of them. And of course, the money she mentioned was something she had earned herself, not inherited from her family. She stepped closer, looking at the boy she loved, the one everyone else called the Devil Sword of Chaos. But neither the hated title nor his current pitiful situation could change her feelings for him. Without hesitation, Seol-hwa looked him in the eyes and asked him to marry her, boldly stating that there was anything or anyone who could stop their marriage now. Unlike what people outside imagined would happen, like the explosive clash of two supernovas, the greatest hero Lunar Sword and the most feared villain Devil Sword, everything was surprisingly calm inside the boy's resting room. The boy, being a little clueless, didn't actually recognize Seol. Even after being reminded of the promise, he just stared at her quietly, then suddenly pointed to a door behind him and said, "You're looking for the Demon Sword of Chaos, right?" He just left the room. But Yu himself realized, with his face plastered on wanted posters everywhere, that this lame trick wasn't going to work. Since he didn't get any answers from her, he figured it was best to take this chance and make a run for it. He awkwardly started walking toward the exit, mumbling apologies and saying he had some urgent business to attend to, but things didn't go as planned. Seal grabbed his hand gently, stopping him, making him to think it might be an end for him. To use shock, instead of hurting him, she did something completely unexpected. She pulled off his glove and placed his hand gently on her cheek. The gesture reminded her of the way he used to show his affection. Feeling Yu's hand, even though she was the one guiding it, made her blush, just like she used to in the past. Just then, she softly asked him to call her name again. Finally, the clueless and forgetful man started to realize who she was, saying, "Are you Lady Seol?" Suddenly, the happy memories of their secret love came rushing back to him. As someone who was sold into Seol's wealthy family as a slave during a famine, he never expected to be treated with kindness, let alone loved by the family's youngest daughter like this. He suddenly realized just how much he missed those days. That was the last thing he remembered before snapping back to reality, finding himself sitting near the same girl he used to secretly love, but now in a private room. As he glanced at her quietly, he realized that Seol hadn't just grown up into a well-grown woman. She had become even more beautiful than before, more than anyone he had ever known. But even knowing who she was now, Yu felt uneasy sitting so close to her. The silence was broken when Seol suddenly asked why Yu wasn't drinking his tea. Startled, the boy awkwardly thanked her and said he'd drink it right away. Trying to be more polite, he added, "My lady," at the end of his sentence. Immediately, Seol's expression darkened. She reminded him again about the promise they'd made, that he wouldn't call her lady. Not wanting to upset her, Yu hesitated and this time called her Lady Seol. But it still wasn't enough for her. She didn't like how distant and formal it sounded, as if he were talking to a stranger. The boy decided to give it a shot and take a step forward. Blushing and too embarrassed to look her in the eyes, he softly said Seol's name and told her he was happy to see her again. That simple sentence was enough to light up her face, turning her into the cheerful girl he remembered. She responded with a smile, saying she was even happier to see him again. Her beautiful face and the way she reacted made it almost impossible for the boy to control his wandering thoughts. To distract himself and calm his wild imagination, Yu quickly pointed to Seol's sword and asked if she had really become a martial artist. Despite having said it many times before, she proudly repeated that she had worked incredibly hard and had become one of the greatest martial artists. And, she added, all that hard work was for the sake of who she loved. Yu didn't visibly act like he had remembered their promise, but the image of him from the last time they met, shouting that he'd become strong and wealthy enough to be worthy of marrying her someday, was something Seol could never forget. It took some time before Yu's jaw dropped in shock as he finally realized what she was talking about. On the other hand, Seol assumed he, just like her, had never forgotten that promise, and his overreaction was because of seeing she remembered it too. The girl then explained how she managed to find him after hearing the rumors about the Demon Sword of Chaos. Hearing his famous title made the boy flinch, knowing she probably had plans to question and tease him about it. But Seol didn't bring it up directly. Instead, she started talking about the rumors surrounding the Demon Sword of Chaos, things like harassing MILF women and skipping out on paying for meals. The way those stories perfectly matched Yu's behavior back when he was a slave made her realize that the feared person everyone talked about was the same boy she had once loved. Seol grabbed Yu's dirty hand and firmly declared that she didn't care about what the world thought of him. It didn't matter to her if he was cruel, hated, or even a bit of a pervert. She loved him just the way he was. There was only one thing she wanted, to marry him, and nothing else. Unlike Seol, who seemed eager to marry him and start a family as soon as possible, Yu clearly wasn't on the same page. Not only did he show no interest in getting married, but he was also coming up with excuses to avoid it altogether. He quickly found one, telling her there was something big standing in the way of their marriage, an enormous amount of debt tying him down. And, for once, he wasn't fully lying. In past, Yahello had tried countless times to learn martial arts and become stronger, but every master he went to would eventually kick him out after seeing his pathetic and weak potential, refusing to train him, while keeping his hard-earned money. One of those days when he hit rock bottom, broke, desperate, and hopeless, someone appeared out of nowhere and offered him money. But in return, Yahello had to agree to do something for that person. That actually was part of the truth, not all of it, but now the scene shifted to the Eternal Bureau Guild, where a woman, dressed without even wearing lingerie, introduced herself as one of the guild's leaders, by the name of Hang Kyung. It turned out she was that person saved Yu by offering money instead of doing what she wanted. And of course, it was Seol who had come all the way here after hearing about it to solve the one problem that was holding Yahello back from marrying her. Seol didn't hold back and immediately questioned the way this woman tricked men like Yahello by paying off their debts and then using them as if she owned them. Of course, Seol came to this conclusion based only on her perspective and Yu's explanation. But Han Kyung herself looked genuinely confused, not understanding why this girl was accusing her of such things. The truth was, Han Kyung was more like a sugar mommy to Yahello. She had been financially supporting him in every way he needed, only in return of using his feared title, and now Yu was starting to regret dragging his only supporter into this awkward mess. Unlike everyone else who hated him for no reason, Hang had not only paid off his debt but also covered his living costs, without asking for much in return. As for Yahello, the real reason he was using this debt excuse to avoid marrying Seol was because of how he thought she saw him. He believed Seol had mistaken him, thinking Yu had become the worthy man as he promised, a warrior or someone who was on her level. The thought of getting into serious trouble later when they were married, being beaten and interrogated after revealing the truth, and not being able to do a thing about it, made the boy freak out and find this way to avoid it. In a panic, he recklessly decided to drag Han Kyung right into the middle of his mess, as she was the only one who Ye could rely on. That was when the woman glanced at Yahello's stupid-looking face, which kind of secretly pleading with her to play along. Being as sharp as ever, Hang quickly picked up on the situation, figuring that Yu brought Seol here hoping to use her help and knowledge to get rid of this problem. Just then, Seol demanded to know the total amount of money Yu owed. Hang hesitated for a moment before saying it was complicated. She wanted to throw out some ridiculously high number for the boy's debt, something so crazy that Seol wouldn't even consider paying it off. Hang, finally, came to a decision and confidently announced that if Seol wanted to clear his entire debt, she'd need to pay 10,000 gold coins. That was exactly what Yu had expected her to say. The dumb boy got happy. He knew there was no chance Seol could come up with such an outrageous amount, especially for someone like him. And even if she tried, it would take her forever to gather it all and bring it here. Hoping to buy himself more time, and maybe even find a way to escape, he suggested they head back and think it over some more. But to everyone's shock, Seol suddenly pulled out a big bag, completely out of nowhere, or maybe out of her ass. A bag stuffed full of gold coins, more than enough to pay off Yuhyol's debt. Both Yuhyol and Hong were stunned, their eyes wide as they wondered where on earth the girl had gotten that massive bag so suddenly. Yuhyol's entire plan had completely fallen apart, and his disappointed expression didn't go unnoticed by Seol. However, she assumed he was feeling ashamed because she was paying off someone like him's debt. Instead of being upset or disappointed by his reaction, Seol tried to comfort him. She gently reassured him, saying that since they were going to get married soon, there wouldn't be his money or her money anymore, as everything would belong to both of them. To make the matter worse, she added that nothing was ever wasteful when it came to Yuhyol. Her words hit hard the boy like an arrow right into his unworthy of love heart. They cut deep, forcing him to rethink his entire decision. Hang Kyung, on the other hand, was still stunned as she stared at the pile of gold coins, thinking it really was way more than she had asked for. But as she glanced at Yuhyol, she realized he's being dragged to an unwanted marriage. There, she thought she needed to take things a step further if she wanted to make Seol feel disappointed or back off. With a sly idea forming in her mind, Hang slowly got to her feet, a mischievous glint in her eyes, and suddenly shouted, "Hold on!" Seol and Yuhyol were just about to leave, but Seol turned back at the sound of Hang's voice, half expecting her to demand more money. However, this wasn't about money at all. Hang stepped toward Yuhyol and, without warning, wrapped her arms tightly around him in a hug. It was as if she was either pretending or maybe even revealing the truth about their actual relationship and the real reason she had been paying for his living expenses. Even Yuhyol himself was caught completely off guard, shocked at the bold move Hang had just pulled. Seol's eyes widened in shock and, of course, disbelief, just from watching this scene. Ignoring her for a moment and with a meaningful glance, Hang leaned in and whispered to Yuhyol, "Don't panic. I'll handle this girl for you." But things didn't play out the way she had expected. Seol wasn't about to let this matter to slide so easily. Her response was immediate and intense. First, her glowing sword appeared in her hand, and then her entire body became cloaked in wild, crackling lightning. She glared at Hang Kyung, her voice sharp and commanding as she demanded, "Step away from Yuhyol right now, or I'll make you do it by force." In that very moment, both Hang and Yuhyol realized they were in deep trouble. They had only two options: either step away from each other peacefully or face the terrifying consequences of Seol's wrath. As soon as Seolhwa started walking forward, Hong began regretting her decision, thinking she might have gone too far this time. On the other hand, Yuhyol was desperately begging Seol to calm down, explaining it was all just a misunderstanding and not what she thought. Seol, however, ignored both of them, still moving closer and demanding they should stay away from each other right now. Her eyes made it clear that she wasn't joking and might actually kill them both. In a panic, trying to convince her and save their lives, Yu blurted out, "Stay calm, Seolhwa. You're someone really important to me." That one sentence worked like magic, like pouring water on a fire. It made the furious girl pause and slowly calm down to her usual self. Seeing this, Yu felt a wave of relief, knowing they were safe now. However, even though Seol wasn't angry anymore, she was heartbroken, sad to think the person she loved had betrayed her with a sugar mommy. Yu wanted to apologize and explain there was no real love between him and that woman, but Seol didn't want to hear any of his excuses. Without a word, she turned and started walking toward the door. Yu ran after her, trying to stop her and explain everything, but she ignored him and kept going. Yuhyol didn't want to hurt her feelings, but Hang seemed pretty pleased with how things turned out. In her opinion, everything worked out perfectly. Yu turned to her in shock. He didn't question or blame Hang about her wild actions. Instead, he let his expression do the talking. Showing upsetting and hurting Seol wasn't his intention at all. Hang returned to her seat and started sharing her experiences as a guild leader and merchant with him. To her, this wasn't exactly the most peaceful solution, but it was definitely the most effective way to stop the unwanted marriage, the only reason Yu had come here in the first place. Yuhyol was surprised, almost stunned, to be reminded of that fact, but instead of feeling happy about achieving his goal, he was filled with guilt. A few minutes later on the other side of village, something caught the attention of the villagers in nearby. It was, of course, the demon sword of chaos. Yu's dark presence and aura surrounding him were something impossible to ignore for them. However, it was all just in their imagination. Yu was simply walking along, consumed by regret for hurting Seolhwa's feelings and making it look like he had cheated on her. These overwhelming feelings of sadness brought back memories of the past when he was just a lowly servant. Back then, Seolhwa had treated him with more than enough kindness, seeing him as an ordinary boy but worthy of her love. Yuhyul couldn't help but wonder why, even after all his efforts to close the gap between them and stand proudly by her side, nothing ever seemed to change. Her kindness and his love always felt just out of reach. The boy made up his mind. He had to find Seol as quickly as possible and explain the truth to her, everything she needed to know. Just then, he overheard a conversation that caught his attention. Not far away, a man was telling his wife that he had just seen a woman with white hair, dressed entirely in white, running through the mountains as if she'd seen a ghost, heading straight toward the edge of a cliff. Hearing this, Yuhyul instantly realized it had to be Seol. His heart sank as he thought she was going to end her life because of his reckless behavior. A moment later, the woman suddenly started trembling in fear, which made her husband wonder if she was scared something terrible might happen to the mysterious woman that he was talking about. But her horror wasn't from his story. It was because of the sight of the demon sword of chaos. Yu slowly revealed his presence by asking her husband exactly where he had seen the woman. Minutes later, Yuhyul was at the location the man had described, panting and completely out of breath. He wasn't sure if he was in the right place, so he decided to look around, hoping to find some sign of her. In first second, his eyes landed on Seolhwa. She was standing at the edge of the cliff, ready to end her life, and it was all because of him. Without hesitation, and faster than a bolt of lightning, the boy dashed forward and hugged her from behind, saying he'd marry her right now if she reconsidered about suiciding. But to his shock, it wasn't the girl, but it was a 200-year-old grandpa, who froze in surprise. His surprise quickly turned to embarrassment, and his face turned bright red at the thought of a young man wanting to marry him and do whatever he wanted. It was only then that Yuhyul realized the ridiculous situation he had just thrown himself into by charging ahead recklessly without checking if it was really Seolhwa. Feeling horribly awkward, he quickly let go, turned away, and started apologizing profusely, explaining that he had mistaken the old man for someone else. But to his surprise, the grandpa wasn't about to let him off the hook so easily. As Yu tried to leave, the old man shouted after him, demanding, "Are you really just going to walk away like that? So irresponsibly?" Yuhyul's eyes widened in shock, realizing the grandpa wasn't talking about himself at all. Instead, he was offering advice about Yu's relationship with Seolhwa, speaking like someone who somehow knew everything that had happened between them, from the past to the present. The old man shouted again, "Do you even know what was reflected in that child's eyes when you hurt her?" He continued, his voice booming with authority. "Anger, disappointment, sadness, whatever it was, don't you dare underestimate the feelings of someone like her." Finally, the boy got what the old man was saying, thinking he must be a messenger from God who came to show him the right way. He turned to thank the old man and ask for some wise advice about his situation. But that's when Yuhyul realized the old man wasn't even talking to him, but more like a crazy man, was talking to the tree behind him. Just then, the man's grandchild came rushing over, scolding his grandfather and asking why he'd come here again without telling him. Yu's jaw dropped. He was completely speechless because in that moment nothing made sense to him. The old man's speech felt like it was directed at him, but it turned out wasn't at all. By the time Yuhyul finally made his way back down the mountain, the sun was setting, and he felt like he'd completely wasted his time. Even so, the old man's words about not underestimating Seol's feelings kept running through his mind, making him feel even worse. When he finally arrived home, his head was hung low, still wondering what he should do next. He was so lost in thought that he didn't even notice Seol standing right there in front of him. He only snapped out of it when she greeted him and welcomed him home, leaving him stunned for a moment. He shouted in disbelief, asking when and how she had gotten in here. Seol casually explained that she'd been here the whole time after leaving him earlier. The girl declared she'd actually found his house before they even ran into each other during the incident that morning. Yuhyul froze for a moment, caught between relief and guilt. He was happy to see Seol safe and sound, but it didn't take long for him to notice her face. She'd clearly been crying a lot today. Seolhwa was surprised that Yuhyul noticed she had been crying, but she tried to deny it. Still, it wasn't something she could hide, and the boy became more persistent, knowing it was because of what happened today and how he had hurt her feelings. He decided to explain everything about him and Han Kyung, making it clear it was all a misunderstanding. However, Seol had already figured out the truth. She knew there wasn't any love or anything that made it look like cheating, but the fact that he went this far just to avoid marrying her, that was what truly hurt her and made her sad and of course angry. Yahello froze when he heard this, realizing she already knew everything, but then the old man's words echoed in his mind, urging him to be honest for once. Instead of denying it or lying to convince her otherwise, he admitted the truth. He confessed that he really couldn't marry her. As soon as Ciel heard those words, tears filled her eyes uncontrollably. She apologized to him with a look of disappointment, avoiding his gaze as she told him she wouldn't bother him anymore and would leave immediately. But Yahello wasn't going to let her go. He placed his hands on her shoulders, stopping her in her tracks. Seolwa's disappointed expression quickly turned to one of shock when Yu blurted out, "No, that's not it, Seolwa." She had been expecting something sweet and reasonable to explain why they couldn't get married. Instead, to her surprise, Yahello started shouting, admitting that his average income was only 200 yen per month, stating that amount of money even wasn't enough for filling his own stomach. It seems that was the real reason he couldn't afford to marry her right now. Seolwa blinked in confusion, not at all expecting this. Yahello, unable to hold back anymore, pointed to the shabby house and confessed that he could only rent it through an acquaintance, thanks to Han Kyung's help, and without her help he would have been sleeping naked on streets. He didn't sugarcoat anything, clarifying that the rumors about him were just exaggerated stories built on misunderstandings. He wasn't some skilled or amazing warrior worthy of being called the demon sword of chaos. He hadn't even fulfilled the promise he made himself. Despite everything, Yahello didn't want to lose Seolwa, not even after breaking her trust. He looked her in the eye and asked if she'd give him another chance, like in the past, back when she loved him unconditionally. He vowed to do whatever it took to become stronger and wealthier, to be the man she deserved, just as he had promised. Then, without thinking, Yu suddenly hugged Ciel tightly, pressing her into his arms, only to show how serious he was about their future. Seolwa froze in surprise as she didn't expect it to happen. She knew well it's been more than 15 years since they hugged each other like this. Yahello was having the hardest time, his face red and completely embarrassed. Still, if he wanted to propose officially and eventually be with the girl he loved, he knew he had to take the first step now. Surprisingly, it worked. The girl agreed to wait as long as it took for him to become rich and strong enough and only then marry each other. Everything seemed settled, but neither of them was ready to let go of the other just yet. Then, Yu did something interesting, something any pervert guy might do in that situation. He lowered his hand from around Seol's neck and, with a sneaky move, touched the girl's lower body without saying any word. Almost immediately, he realized it wasn't the smartest move. After all, they weren't even a couple yet. He wanted to do something bold, but he quickly decided it'd be better to wait until they were officially husband and wife. But Seolwa wasn't letting go either. She held onto him tightly, her grip firm, almost possessive. Suddenly she pushed Yahello backward, making him stumble as his foot caught on something. His back hit the wall, and before he could react, Seolwa leaned in uncomfortably close. So close that Yahello, already blushing furiously, felt like he was going to lose control. Acting all innocent, he tried to stop Seolwa before things went too far, but Seolwa wasn't planning to back off until she got what she wanted. She crawled closer, upright enough to be face-to-face with the flustered boy, and whispered slowly, "Let's have the wedding ceremony in front of our future kids." And with that, they started messing around with each other. Just as anyone would expect, their playful screams filled the air. Meanwhile, someone passing by in the alley overheard their voices. Of course, he had no idea what they were actually doing. Instead, he assumed the lunar sword had finally tracked down the demon sword of chaos, and now the two were locked in an intense battle. Faster than lightning, rumors began to spread. With each retelling, the story got twisted, exaggerated, and sprinkled with everyone's own perspectives and judgments. Before long, not just the village, but the entire world was buzzing with wild versions of the event. And, as usual, no one had any clue what actually happened. Eventually, the rumors turned to the demon sword killed the lunar sword and reached someone specific, a pink-haired girl who seemed visibly overjoyed by the news. Of course, she wasn't alone. She was guarded by another woman, who didn't hesitate to ask if she was planning to take action now. The pink-haired girl gave a confident nod and said, "Since one of the greatest stars in the world has fallen, it's my responsibility to step in and make sure the world knows my name and my guild's name." A few days later, on an early, peaceful morning, Seol woke up after spending a long and wonderful night with the so-called ugly guy. She was fixing her hair with a satisfied smile on her face. At the same time, she kept glancing at the door of the house where Yu was still sleeping. She couldn't have been happier, knowing she no longer had to search for her childhood love. Eager for him to wake up so they could practice some wrestling techniques again. Only thinking about it made her to feel excitement bubbling inside her. But her peaceful and dreamy moment was suddenly shattered when someone appeared out of nowhere, shouting angrily and calling Yu an ugly bastard rascal. Of course, this made Seol's mood change in an instant. The man didn't even notice her and kept yelling, "Let's end this today, demon sword of chaos." He was clearly not planning to leave until he gave Yu a proper beating. Despite knowing who Yu was, the infamous demon sword of chaos, the man seemed completely unafraid. In an instant, as he said, "I haven't forgotten what day it is," a sword appeared and pierced through the air, stopping him mid-sentence. Unsurprisingly, it was Lady Seol, who couldn't stand to see her boyfriend being insulted by this scruffy-looking man. Pressing the sword closer to him, she glared and demanded, "What's so important about today that you haven't forgotten?" Terrified and lost for words, the man froze. But before he could respond, Seol smirked and answered her own question by saying, "It's your death anniversary." Her words sent chills down his spine, but somehow he managed to muster the courage to stammer out a question. "Who even are you? I've never seen you before." Leaning in slowly, her voice low and laced with anger, Seol whispered, "I'm the mistress of this house." The man blinked in disbelief before nervously revealing the truth. He was the landlord of the house, the very house she had just claimed as being its mistress. That's when it hit Lady Seol. She had gone completely overboard again. But of course, this was just part of her personality, and there wasn't much she could do about it. The man, sensing an opportunity to defuse the situation, quickly clarified, "I'm just here to collect the rent. That's all I meant when I said I hadn't forgotten this day." Realizing her mistake, Seol stepped back, letting the awkward tension settle. With that, the uncomfortable situation came to an end, and the scene shifted to the house kitchen. There, Lady Seol, back to her usual self, was cooking up a storm like a pro chef, preparing food for the day ahead. The so-called demon sword of chaos finally woke up after all the commotion, completely clueless about why the landlord was even there. The landlord, however, wasn't about to let things slide. He was furious. Not only had Yu failed to pay rent for several months, but now his so-called wife had tried to kill him without even knowing who he was. And to make matters worse, this landlord was also the innkeeper whose inn Yu and Lady Seol had managed to turn into a ruined building. It all made sense why the man was shouting in anger. But Yu, ever the broke and resourceful man, decided to play the victim. He apologized profusely, insisting it wasn't his fault at all. The landlord, however, wasn't buying it, and made it clear that an apology wasn't going to cut it. His fury was palpable, until he noticed a shadowy figure watching him closely. Of course, it was none other than Lady Seol. She stood there, silently, with a sharp cleaver in her hand, her eyes locked on him like a predator sizing up its prey. The landlord quickly realized that for his own safety, it might be better to handle this situation more peacefully. A few tense moments later, they all moved outside, sitting across from each other to talk things through. Seizing the opportunity while Seol wasn't around, the landlord cautiously leaned toward Yu and whispered, "Who is that crazy woman? And what did she mean by calling herself the mistress of this house?" At first, Yu was taken aback by the sudden question, but he quickly composed himself and confidently explained that it was the same woman he had mentioned before, the lady he once served and promised his future to. The ugly landlord vaguely remembered hearing the story before, but he had never imagined it was real. He always thought Yu was just talking about some fantasy or dream of his. Even though the landlord knew of Seolhwa and her reputation as the Lunar Sword, he never had the chance to meet her in person, so when Yu mentioned her name, the man froze in shock. Part of his surprise came from the fact that he couldn't wrap his head around someone as beautiful as Seolhwa choosing to live with someone like this ugly loser. But what truly left him stunned was realizing he had heard some unsettling rumors about them. The irony was that Yu was the only one completely unaware of these stories about himself and Seolhwa. Apparently, after that magical night for Yu and Seol, several wild rumors had started to spread. And as an innkeeper who interacted with countless people, the landlord had heard most of them. Of course, he had dismissed them all as nonsense. Until now. Now, one particular rumor seemed to click. The story about how the demon sword of chaos had tricked and cowardly trapped the lunar sword by hypnotizing her, enslaving her, and forcing her to do whatever dirty, shameful things he wanted. Hearing this for the first time, Yu freaked out. He never imagined people would come up with such wild stories about him. But honestly, if anyone saw how Seol cared for this ugly guy, they probably wouldn't come up with a better explanation. Just then, Seol herself joined the conversation, bringing out the well-prepared food she'd made for them. Even in front of the landlord, she didn't hold back. With love and care, she started feeding her future husband, as if no one else was there. Yu, completely caught off guard, was impressed by her boldness, while the landlord sat there watching the scene unfold. This only made him feel even more conflicted. On one hand, it made the rumors seem more believable. On the other hand, it sparked a mix of jealousy, or maybe even disgust, at their public display of affection. Still, being a kind-hearted man, he decided not to interfere. Instead, he chose to warn them about how the whole world now saw them as two shining, opposite stars of martial arts, a pairing that had already attracted major attention. Unlike you, who always panicked at the slightest problem, Seol remained calm. Gently, she grabbed his hand and, with a loving, reassuring look, reminded him that he had nothing to worry about as long as they stood by each other's side. That one look of her was enough to give any man the confidence to face an entire army alone, and Yu was no exception. Yu raised his hand and clenched his fist, silently vowing to himself that he would become a master no matter what. He promised to buy a proper house for her, and when that day came, nothing in the world would tear them apart. Their eyes met afterward, and they looked like they were ready to start another round of baby-making. Luckily, the landlord was still there, watching them with a disgusted expression. He made a circle with his fingers and, in a mocking voice, like he could read the boy's mind, said he should probably focus on paying his rent and debts before getting carried away. To his surprise, Yu immediately came up with a brilliant plan for that. Hours passed, and the sun was slowly giving way to the moon. The landlord, who had been irritated earlier, now looked excited because Yu and Lady Seol had gone back to Yu's sugar mommy to borrow some money to clear his debts. To Yu's surprise, after he calmly explained how everything had been resolved with Seol, Hang didn't hesitate to return Seol's gold, something he never expected. They didn't keep the landlord waiting long and came back quickly. The man's excitement grew even more when he saw the amount of gold they brought. It was tempting enough for him to offer his shabby house in exchange for the gold right then and there. However, Yu turned down the offer right away. Not only did he know that the house wasn't worth that much, but even if it was, they needed to save some money for later. Besides, it was Seol's money, not his, so he couldn't just waste it like that. Hearing this, Seol grabbed the guy's hand, placed her head on his chest, and gently reminded him that the gold belonged to both of them, not just her. Like a pair of lovebirds, they started messing around, rubbing against each other and completely ignoring the landlord, who was standing there on the verge of losing his patience because of their childish behavior. Still, he didn't say anything, and the all of them just headed back to their place, continuing their playful antics without a care for the landlord. Trying to act like he wasn't bothered, the man suddenly started talking about his plans for the house, asking Yu to take good care of it since he wanted to rent it out in the future. Yu didn't hesitate to reassure him, promising that he wouldn't let the house take even the slightest damage from now on. He hadn't even finished talking when, all of a sudden, his face and the surroundings lit up with a sudden burst of lightning. It seemed like fate was determined to mess with Yu, as he quickly realized that the house they were just talking about was now up in flames. It didn't take long for the other villagers to notice and gather around to watch the spectacle. Meanwhile, the landlord and Yu stood there in complete shock, frozen as they watched the house being devoured by fire. Slowly, the landlord reached for the bag of gold and took it, believing that Yu was responsible for the house's safety. Yu just stood there, his eyes and mouth wide open, too stunned to even try stopping him from taking the money. Things only got worse when, out of the flames, the pink-haired girl from earlier suddenly leapt forward, grinning smugly as she proudly announced she was the one behind it all. As soon as her feet hit the ground, she called out Yu's title like she'd known him forever and went on to introduce herself. "I'm the next head of the Four Heavens cult, the Poisonous Phoenix, Tang Hai." But instead of looking intimidating, she was more like a hyper 13-year-old, flat-chested and full of energy, practically bouncing as she yelled that she was there for one reason only: to assassinate him. Aside from Yu and his landlord, who were both completely caught off guard by all these unexpected events, the crowd was eager to see what would happen next. Tang Hai stood there fearlessly, all alone in front of the roaring flames, while the rest of the villagers formed a circle around her, watching intently. After what she clearly thought was an epic entrance, she immediately challenged the demon sword of chaos, giving Yu the chance to make the first move. But before she could finish basking in her moment, two massive waves of lightning suddenly shot toward her. The deadly blasts weren't aimed directly at her but passed close enough to make their presence known, destroying what little remained of the burning house behind her. In an instant, Tang froze, caught off guard by the unexpected attack, and for the first time, her confidence wavered. That's when Seol stepped forward, her expression cold and determined. She announced that if Tang wanted to fight, she'd have to face her first before even thinking about going after Yu. Seol made it clear she could have ended Tang right then and there, but chose to play fair. This time, though, she wasn't holding back. She was ready to take down anyone who insulted the only reason she lived and breathed. Instead of retreating, Tang smirked, her confidence quickly returning, and declared she was more than ready to face Seol. "Long time no see, Lunar Sword," she said with a challenging grin, making it clear she was already familiar with her opponent. Lady Seal kept walking forward, surrounded by a glowing white aura and flashes of light. Ahead of her stood the overly confident, flat-chested kid, her body radiating a green flame-like energy, waiting to confront her. Tang Hai hadn't expected to run into Seal on her way to capture Yu, or at least pretended to, but she still believed Seal was no big deal and wouldn't be much of a challenge. Seal paused for a moment, visibly annoyed by Tang, who was rambling on and on like an overly excited child. Watching Seol's expression, Tang decided not to waste any more time and show her exactly what she was capable of. With confidence, she launched her secret move, fully intending to finish Seol off in one blow. Unfortunately for Tang, her plan failed miserably. Within seconds, she was half buried in the dirt, with only her head and chest sticking out. She was completely stunned at how easily she had been defeated. In the meantime, nearby villagers worked together to put out the flames that had engulfed the house. The boy didn't seem to care much about the damage, unlike the landlord, who wanted to make Tang to pay for his house. Instead, he was more focused on figuring out why this hyperactive kid had suddenly shown up, burned his house down, and tried to assassinate him. Tang, despite being defeated and captured, refused to admit anything. She acted like she was the victim in all this, and Demon Sword of Chaos was harassing her. But in reality, this was all part of her plan. As the heir to a powerful noble family, Tang wasn't about to go down without a fight, so she just needed to buy herself some time to come up with something. Just then, someone suddenly descended from the sky, landing right in the middle of the scene. It was, of course, Tang's loyal underling, a skilled martial artist. As Tang shouted, "Come forth, my royal and excellent assistant," Seol calmly placed her hand on the woman's head and used her abilities to bury her in the ground, just like she had done to Tang earlier. Tang was making a huge fuss, calling that woman every mighty and impressive title she could think of. But within seconds, before she could even realize it, her hope turned into pure disappointment when her assistant was completely defeated in a flash. Yu, watching the whole thing from a distance, was stunned. He couldn't believe how Seol single-handedly took down these two so-called skilled women in such a one-sided battle. Later, after the chaos had settled down, Yu questioned the pair to figure out why they had caused all this trouble. Tang, still brimming with misplaced confidence, boldly claimed she was just doing her duty as a hero and trying to save the world from its greatest enemy. She explained that since she couldn't find Yu at his house, she came up with a simple strategy, burning the house down to force him to return. It was a statement that definitely didn't sit well with the landlord, who wasn't thrilled to hear about her destructive plan. Moments later, Yu was completely shocked when Tang brought up one of the countless rumors she'd heard recently. She claimed that the so-called Demon Sword of Chaos had taken Seol's parents hostage and was forcing her to do whatever he wanted. Tang even said one of her reasons for coming here was to rescue Seol and free her parents. Yu suddenly froze, his mind racing. Something didn't add up. Just moments ago, Tang had been trying to kill Seol, and now she was claiming she came here to save her because of some rumors? It didn't make any sense. Tang seemed to be hiding her real intentions, but to her surprise, her own assistant, the one she proudly called the Silent Demon previously, decided to spill the truth. The assistant bluntly revealed that Tang's actual goal was to use this opportunity to catch the lunar sword off guard and assassinate her, not the boy. Seol, who had been watching the whole scene with curiosity, listened carefully, wondering why Tang had targeted her. The Silent Demon didn't hold back, laying everything out in the open. She explained that it all started a year ago during a martial arts competition, where Tang had been utterly defeated by the lunar sword. Tang, clearly panicking, tried to shut her assistant up. She yanked at her long hair, smacking it into the woman's face in an attempt to get her to stop talking. "You're my underling, not theirs," Tang hissed, desperate to make her come to her senses. But the assistant completely ignored her and just kept spilling the truth. The Silent Demon glanced at the aftermath of Seol's earlier attack and admitted that she too had wanted to go after her, not just to avenge Tang's defeat, but also to make a name for herself. However, she knew she wasn't strong enough to take the famous lunar sword on, so she didn't dare make a move until now. Yu watched in surprise as the woman went on to declare that she had also come here after hearing the same rumors, stating she planned to make a name for herself by killing two birds with one stone. The plan? Knock the Demon Sword of Chaos out, take him down, and then swoop in as the hero who saved the lunar sword. After hearing this bizarre story, Yu and Seol exchanged confused looks. Were these two supposed to be master and subordinate, or were they just two random strangers who only cared about themselves? Tang, unable to handle the humiliation any longer, suddenly let out a scream that sounded like someone had just poked her in the butt with something sharp. In her frustration, Tang finally started admitting everything, confirming what her assistant had said about her true intentions. She confessed that Seol's overwhelming power hadn't just humiliated her, it had made her realize there were probably countless others out there like her, counting down the seconds, waiting for their chance to take revenge on Seol. Seol, on the other hand, didn't bother saying anything, neither to defend her reputation nor to explain her true intentions. Just then, Tang ordered her less than trustworthy assistant to move on to the backup plan before things got any worse. At first, the talkative demon didn't seem interested in cooperating. However, when Tang kept pushing, she suddenly sprang to life, leaping out of her grave and freeing herself in one swift motion. In the blink of an eye, she appeared right in front of Yu, catching him completely off guard. He realized he had let his guard down, but deep down, he knew it wouldn't have mattered. Even if he had been on high alert, as a third-rate warrior, he couldn't have reacted in time anyway. Their gazes locked, the silent demon, ready to do her job, and the boy, bracing himself to be torn apart. Seol, who had also let her guard down and hadn't seen this coming, quickly tried to step in and protect Yu, but in the very next moment, her eyes widened in shock. The demon didn't harm Yu. Instead, she appeared on top of a nearby cliff, with someone else standing close to her. Tang's expression shifted, turning into that of a cheerful, overly confident kid again. She said casually, "This wasn't really what I wanted to do, but you forced me to use this dirty trick." That's when everything started to come to light. The silent demon suddenly brought out a 100-year-old granny from nowhere and held a knife to her throat. Yu reacted like he recognized the old woman, like she looked really familiar to him. Seeing this gave Tang her confidence back. She shouted at Yu to surrender immediately before she used his precious hostage against him to force his hand. Unfortunately for Tang, Yu didn't actually know who the granny was. He just felt sorry for her. That's when the atmosphere turned heavy, and an awkward silence filled the air. Everyone stood there watching him in shock. Tang, however, didn't buy it. She thought the so-called demon sword was just pretending not to know the granny so he wouldn't lose the upper hand. To snap him out of it, Tang yelled, "It's your mother, the one who gave birth to you. How can you say you don't know her?" Yu scratched his ugly face awkwardly and looked sad. After a moment of hesitation, he finally said, "My mom, she died when I was only 5. Tang was speechless. Her eyes went wide and her mouth hung open in disbelief. But her shock didn't last long because everything was confirmed when the granny suddenly started shouting in anger. "My lost son's name is Yu Hyun, not Yu Hyol." She went on to remind everyone, as if scolding them, that she had told them this many times before. Just as everything seemed to calm down, and Tang realized she had seriously messed up this time, an wild but effective idea suddenly popped into her head. Since she had nothing to lose at this point, she decided to create a massive scene. She started shouting and screaming at the top of her lungs, making a fuss about why Yu didn't care about his mother's safety and why he wouldn't just surrender. She didn't hold back, exaggerating everything even though she knew perfectly well that the old woman wasn't related to Yu. Surprisingly, the granny decided to cooperate with Tang and the silent demon. She suddenly began crying out for help, begging as if her life really depended on Yu's actions. Yu, caught off guard, fell right into their trap. He awkwardly wanted to put an end to the madness, but at the same time, he didn't want to surrender and throw his life away. That's when Tang's plan started to work. The commotion drew a crowd as people gathered to see what all the noise and chaos were about. Things quickly escalated for Yu as onlookers began judging him harshly, saying things like, "What kind of person wouldn't care if his mother was killed?" Or, "Would he really cut ties with his own mother just to save himself?" Yu knew deep down that the granny wasn't his mother, but hearing all those ridiculous accusations from the crowd made him start to doubt himself. The pressure was getting to him, and he began reconsidering whether he should just do what Tang wanted to put an end to it all. But Tang's plan turned out to be a double-edged sword. Some of the onlookers shifted their attention to her, questioning her actions and mocking her. They called her a weirdo for giving herself the nickname Poisonous Phoenix and claiming to be the head of a noble family. Just like Yu, Tang found it hard to handle the judgment and ridicule. It was karma for her actions, and she was utterly helpless against it. However, being a 13-year-old flat-chested, hyperactive kid, she couldn't stand hearing those insults thrown at her like that. So, she decided to act. With a bit of effort, she pulled her small, half-buried body out of the ground. As soon as Tang got free, she called out to Yu, making both Seol and the boy turn around, only to realize their little troublemaker was on the loose again. This time, Tang wasn't in the mood to waste time messing around or giving some childish speech. Instead, she pulled out 8 poisonous darts from who knows where and declared it was time to settle everything once and for all and make a run for it. Poor Yu was left completely stunned. He barely had a second to catch his breath before things escalated even more. Every moment felt like it was spiraling further out of control, and now it had reached its breaking point. Without any hesitation, Tang threw all 8 darts at once, aiming straight for Yu, and probably Seol too. As expected, Lady Seol effortlessly blocked all the incoming threats like it wasn't something she even needed to worry about. But what Seol didn't realize was that Tang had only been causing a scene to grab her attention, and it worked. The real danger was behind her. The silent demon had quietly aimed much larger darts at them. Lady Seol, despite everything, managed to block the dart at the very last second before it could hit her. But unfortunately, that wasn't the only dart the silent demon had thrown. Another one had been aimed at Yu Hyol, and she hadn't noticed it in time to block it. Being completely useless and unskilled, Yu just stood there, doing absolutely nothing. He didn't even try to dodge. Instead, he simply accepted the dart with open arms. But the moment it hit him, he quickly realized he should have at least tried to move out of the way. The pain was unbearable. Seeing this, Lady Seol was left stunned. She couldn't believe what she was witnessing. The thought hit her hard. Her future husband might actually die because she underestimated their enemies. The poisonous dart didn't just hit the boy, it went straight through him, like it was as fast as a bullet. Seol ran toward Yu and caught him in her arms. Even the landlord rushed over, panicking, afraid this might be the boy's final moments. Lady Seol couldn't stop blaming herself for everything, convinced it was all her fault. Her eyes filled with tears of regret, thinking that she could have saved Yu if only she'd noticed the sneaky attack a second earlier. She was sure Yu was done for, but when she looked at him, she realized he didn't look like someone on the verge of death. And then, to her shock, Yu said something strange. He didn't feel any pain at all, like he was totally fine. He just felt a little dizzy. Hearing this, Seol hugged him tightly, overwhelmed with relief that her ugly boyfriend was okay. Yu, feeling better now, hugged her back and apologized for making her worry so much. The landlord, on the other hand, stood there frozen, not because of their emotional embrace, but because he was absolutely certain the dart had pierced Yu's body and gone right through him. Seol had the same question burning in her mind. How could he be completely fine after something like that? Yu admitted he'd felt the impact too, but he brushed it off, thinking it was something as small as a needle. That's why he believed he was okay. Tang was listening to their conversation but decided to crush their hopes by saying those darts were coated with the deadliest venom, one that no one could survive. Standing there in her mismatched pants, she held up a small bottle of venom and called it the 100 fragrant root poison. Yu believed her instantly, horrified to realize it was the most potent poison from Tang's clan. The flat-chested girl went on to explain that the poison must have already started spreading through Yu's body. She said that soon, when it reached his body's core, he would die in the most excruciating pain. Yu wasn't feeling anything yet, but he was frozen in shock, wondering how such a tiny amount of poison on a single dart could do all of that before killing him. Then Tang revealed the final, chilling secret behind the poison. She explained that the reason it was considered the deadliest was because it spread and multiplied using internal energy. The stronger someone's internal energy, the more lethal the poison became. At that moment, Yu suddenly understood why he wasn't feeling any pain. For someone like him, with zero internal energy, the poison was completely useless, like smoking a cigarette and expecting instant death. Tang, however, didn't know that. She had assumed that someone carrying the Demon Sword of Chaos title would have an absurd amount of internal energy, enough to make the poison 100 times deadlier than it would be for an ordinary person. She was so sure of her assumption that she just stood there, waiting to see Yu collapse and die at any moment. But nothing happened. The only thing Yu felt was a slight stinging sensation at the spot where the dart, or needle, had hit him. On the other hand, the pre-active kid couldn't help but wonder if she had miscalculated the timing or something, because by now the poison should have at least started showing some side effects. Before anything serious could happen, the landlord hurried off to grab some medicine, just in case. Meanwhile, Lady Seol started crying again, bawling like a little kid, thinking that because of her mistake, Yu could actually be dead by now. A little distance away, Tang was staring at her dart, or needle, or whatever it was, wondering if she had forgotten to poison it. If that wasn't the case, then why wasn't the poison doing anything to the guy? Glancing at her poison bottle, the flat-chested, overly eager girl began to wonder if she had accidentally used something else instead of her clan's venom. To confirm her suspicion, she decided to test it out. Tang lightly tapped her pointer finger on the tip of the needle. It only took a few seconds for Seol and Yu to notice something was seriously wrong with the overly eager girl. That tiny amount of poison that entered her body with that tap was enough to send her into extreme agony, exactly the kind of pain she had expected Yu to feel. But at least now, she was sure the poison was working perfectly fine. Hours, or maybe even days later, in an unknown place, after being lucky enough to have survived, Tang slowly started to regain consciousness. It didn't take long for her to recall the last thing that happened to her. She immediately sat up on the bed she was resting on and shouted, "Where am I?" Yu was sitting a little farther away, waiting for her to wake up. Without much emotion, he casually answered her question with, "You're in the village clinic." The last thing Tang expected to see was the so-called Demon Sword of Chaos acting like he actually cared about her well-being. The boy didn't miss the chance to tease her and explained with a smirk how he had brought her there after her spectacular seizure on the ground. Then, with a creepy grin on his face, Yu added that they could continue and settle everything that got left unfinished before she passed out, if she was up for it. But Tang wasn't in any condition to do anything. Her body was still visibly trembling, the lingering effects of the venom reminding her just how potent her poison really was. She couldn't help but think that Yu must be someone who had achieved ultimate mastery over controlling internal energy, so perfect that even her deadly poison couldn't harm him. In simple terms, only someone as powerful as a sect leader could have pulled that off. Still clueless about the truth, Tang turned to Yu and asked, "Why did you spare my life, even after I tried to kill you multiple times?" According to Yu, actually Seol had been angry enough to let Tang die for hurting her precious boyfriend, but it seemed he had insisted on saving her. Yu claimed he convinced Seol by saying he had some unfinished business that only the two of them could handle. The flat-chested girl froze for a moment, realizing she was nothing more than a hopeless kid in front of him, thinking if even the lunar sword had surrendered to him, then someone like her had no choice but to accept whatever he said. Clenching her fists in frustration, Tang hated the idea of being defenseless and humiliated like this. She had dreamed of becoming a righteous hero, yet here she was, ending up as some kind of servant to a devilish guy. But as much as it burned her, she also realized something else. The rumors weren't true. It didn't seem there was any hostage situation or brainwashing that forced the lunar sword to defend this guy. Yu, still wearing his deadly serious expression, interrupted her thoughts and cut straight to the point, stating what they needed to do next. But the moment he mentioned her family and clan's name, before he could even finish, Tang jumped in and interrupted him. She might have looked like an impulsive kid, but she wasn't about to let her family take the heat for her actions. Firmly, she announced that she would personally take full responsibility for whatever he wanted her to do. That's when Yu didn't hold back and bluntly stated that she owed him 10,000 gold coins for the burnt-down house and, oh, some extra for all the trouble she caused him. Without a second thought, she agreed, thinking she could easily gather the gold and pay him off. But here's the catch. There was a huge problem. Yu wanted the first payment right now. Tang, on the other hand, didn't even have a single gold coin to her name, so Yu decided to get creative. There, he suggested she could do something instead if she really wanted to pay off the debt faster. And no, it wasn't that kind of dirty thing you might be thinking. Instead, they headed to the landlord's guest house, where Tang was stuck working as an attendant for him. She'd have to keep at it long enough to clear her debt before she could go. Now, as a noble girl and a martial artist, Tang struggled hard with her new job. For the most part, it was a nightmare. She couldn't stop complaining to Yu every chance she got. She never imagined the demon sword would drag her into something like this, working to pay off her debt. In her head, she thought Yu and his waifu were planning to do something forbidden or sinister to her body, but nope, it was just her wild imagination running loose. She snapped out of her daydream the moment someone shouted, "4 guests just arrived. They need service on the 2nd floor." Before Tang could even react, Seol, in front of everyone, like they didn't even exist, plopped herself right onto Yu's legs and rested her head on his chest. She seemed a little suspicious that Tang might be up to something shady or planning to hurt him in some way, so even when Yu told her to get up, she flat out refused. Yu, on the other hand, calmly explained that he didn't think Tang would try anything. He believed she wasn't going anywhere or doing anything to hurt him. She had already admitted her mistake and was willing to make up for it, no matter how long it took or how much they made her suffer. And with Seol being all cute and lovely on his lap, Yu couldn't even bring himself to think about forcing Tang to pay off her debt in any dirty or twisted way. The girl got convinced, but from the way Yu was acting like barely holding himself back, making it clear for Seol that something was bothering him. For a split second, Seol wondered if maybe her weight was bothering him, or if he was just embarrassed to be in such a situation in public. She attempted to get up and head back to her seat, but before she could, Yu wrapped his arm around her waist and stopped her. Even if he was a little embarrassed, he wasn't about to hold back from comforting the love of his life, even in public. And just like that, the two of them went right back to acting like lovesick teenagers, rubbing and fondling each other like no one else was in the room. Nobody around could handle watching that scene, but the landlord and Tang were the exceptions. They just stand there, wondering how on earth that adorable goddess could be so in love with that ugly, no-good rascal. Meanwhile, in a city on the other side of the country, Tang's assistant was making her way through a packed, noisy street, feeling absolutely miserable from the heat. Even though it was spring, the temperature was unbearable for her. That was until she revealed her little secret. She'd been hiding her true identity under a perfectly crafted mask this whole time, but since no one in this city would recognize her anyway, and to help herself cool down, she decided to take it off. As soon as she did, she felt a lot better. She figured she could rest here for a while before the next time she crossed paths with Yu Hyul and Lady Seol, a moment she couldn't wait to experience again.